Hello everybody and welcome to JTV. Well, we had a fantastic sort of reception to the interview we did with Rabbi Friedman just a few weeks ago. So I'm delighted to say that we've got him back on the show to discuss some more topics and hopefully can experience some paradigm shifts in other areas of Judaism that I felt I personally experienced in such an enormous way on the previous interview that we did with him. So Rabbi Friedman, thank you so much again for making the time to be with us here on JTV. And if you're up for it, let's just dive straight into some questions. So the first thing that the thing that I wanted to do today was to talk about some of the big themes and stories that occur in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and talk about some of the misconceptions that people have about them, because I really think they can do so much damage, and in some ways can be a real Chilul Hashem, where people misinterpret the kind of God, who we believe God to be. It's one, I think there's a lot of a God of greatness and fear and punishment, and it's not that difficult to get that impression when you read the Torah, but you don't believe that's the way we should be reading it. So there are a few different things that I wanted to talk about, and perhaps I don't mind if you want to take the lead in terms of sort of breaking down some of the stories. But two that immediately come to mind for me is, number one, the story of the flood, which seems like a great example of divine punishment and wrath and fury. And another sort of head-scratching one is the story of the spies, where we see the Jews, somehow they've had all these miracles, and yet they're somehow suspicious of what God's going to do when he takes them into the land of Israel. So those were two ones that sort of came to me sort of immediately, but happy to sort of throw the ball into your court and let you take it from here, and I'll jump in every so often with some questions.
That is really, really fundamental and crucial issues, because how we approach the Torah and what tone of voice we give the Torah will make all the difference in the world. So let's start off with an interesting observation. A philosopher asked one of the sages, how can you believe in the resurrection of the dead? Don't you see how illogical that is? Because all the people who are alive and healthy and vigorous, strong, they're all going to die. So don't you see the direction of reality is from life to death? Even those who are alive are going to die. So how do you believe that those who are dead are going to live? If the live can't stay alive, death must be really powerful. So how do you think, how do you believe, how can you even imagine that the dead will come alive? The sage's answer was very relevant and important for all time. He basically said, you assume life and then you observe what happens. You're right. There is life, and life ends in death. But you're not starting at the beginning. Before there was life, there was nothing. And God said, let there be, and then there was. So out of nothing comes life. And then life ends in death. But life came out of nothing. So if God can create life out of nothing from that which does not exist, then why wouldn't God be able to create a life that already did exist? So the bigger miracle is not life and death. The big miracle is something out of nothing. So start at the beginning. First there was nothing, and God created life. So to bring a life back after it already had one life is child's play compared to creating something out of nothing. We have to bear that in mind. All of existence, all of creation comes from nothing. So it must have a very important purpose, a very important objective to bring everything out of nothing. So when we read the Torah, we can't just assume life and then the end of life is death. That's a short-sighted view. We have to take the long view. God, who created everything out of nothing, why was he bringing a flood? So again, we can be short-sighted. Oh, people were bad. God got angry, so he punished them and killed them. And that's it? That's the extent of your vision? Torah is a Torah of kindness and a Torah of life. Wherever there seems to be a lack of kindness on God's part, or a lack of life, you have to rethink it. Torah is all about kindness and life. So let's use the flood as an example. The impression we get from the Torah, superficially, is that God is always angry. He's always judging us, and we're never good enough. And as a vengeful punishment, God kills people. He smites them down with lightning bolts and all sorts of stuff. That's absurd. Let's look at it a little differently. This is God's world, God's creation. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. We are guests. We are invited into this world that God created. Now imagine you have guests in your house and they won't abide by any of your rules. They're selling your furniture. They're repainting the house. They're taking out a mortgage on your house. How long would you tolerate that? Now, of the 613 commandments, which are God's conditions for living in his world, of all of them, how many are punishable by death?
Is it maybe a handful? 3, 4, 5?
Which means out of 613 commandments, 613 needs that God has for his world, his kitchen, you can violate 570 something, whatever. You can violate his will 500 times, and you're still welcome in his kitchen. I mean, if you cross the red line, okay, then you're not welcome anymore. So what does a death penalty mean? It means you're not welcome anymore. You got to leave. Only for a handful of things? That's pretty tolerant. So let's keep things in perspective. The flood, nobody was doing any good. The Torah hadn't been given yet. So nobody was doing mitzvahs, but people were doing a lot of evil, primarily against each other.
Everyone?
It seems like, yes. It was lawless. There were no laws. So people were being destructive of life on earth. Self-destructive. So God said, this can't be fixed. So we'll start all over again. All the experimentation. The world was new. Human beings were new. They were experimenting with the worst kind of lawlessness. So really what happened was this. In their freedom of choice, the human beings corrupted themselves terribly, intolerably. So God said, the world has been blemished, the world has been sullied, and we need to start all over. But we need to start off clean. So the flood was actually bringing the world to a mikvah. And that's why the water had to cover the top of the mountains. Because when you go to a mikvah, even your hair has to be submerged. You have to be completely submerged so that you're returning to your primordial condition, and then you're cleansed. So ultimately, the waters of the flood were like the waters of a mikvah, and the earth was cleansed and purified so that it can start all over again innocently. That tells us what death means. Death means let's stop what's going on, let's clean everything up and start all over again. So the same souls that were populating the world in the time of the flood, they left the world, got cleansed, and then came back post-flood. And then their lives were much more orderly. So the popular question that most people at least think about, did God not know that the first 10 generations are going to be miserable, bad, confused? And if he knew, why was he punishing them?
And if he's not a punisher, or if we're misreading it, why does he use such language in the Torah?
That's why we need to translate words correctly. Like, Kate's kol basar bo lefonai. The time has come to end all life on earth. But look at the words. Kate's kol basar. The flesh has been corrupted, not the souls. So those same souls can be redeemed and they can do well, but they need to start all over again. So what ended was not life. What ended was the flesh, the ugliness of it. That needed to be cleansed and purified, and then they could start again. What happened by the flood? The world had been overwhelmed with generosity and kindness. And that's why people lived to be 900 years old. Animals grew to be 20 feet tall. It was overmuch, too much. After the flood, God said, from now on, their lifespan will be 120. Quite a change. Animals will not grow to be 20 feet tall. Vegetables will not be huge. So the world kind of settled down into what we now know is the norm. To live beyond 120 is an exception. To get to be 10 feet tall, an exception. Rare. Since the flood. So although the flood seems like a totally destructive thing, it turns out that there was a very positive side to it. It was cleansing, it was forgiving, and it was settling into a more realistic and a more doable life form. We became normal. after the chaos of the experimenting of the first generations who didn't really know what life was about. And that's a necessary progression. Like every child, the life is chaotic. They're out of control. They can produce no good, but they can be very destructive. Did you ever see a child empty a bookcase of all its books? Very common. Did you ever see a child put books back into a bookcase? Never. Because they're going through their chaos stage, which is a necessary part of growing up. You have to start off with crazy enthusiasm that you cannot control, and then settle all of that energy into a productive pattern. That's how God created the world. First there was darkness, then there was day. First there was chaos, then there was order. So once the Torah was given, that's when the orderly universe really began. Instructions, a user's manual, which didn't exist before. And so there was a lot of abuse of life, of the universe, of nature. Torah gave us the plan, the structured world. So we can forgive people who existed before the giving of the Torah, because without the instructions, what do you expect? And that's why Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the people who had a structured life, a disciplined life, a purposeful life, they were amazing. They were amazing. In a time of chaos, they saw some purpose, direction, productive behavior. But it didn't really become available to the average person until the Torah was given. Now, every human being can be the most productive, the most creative, without any chaos at all. So the end story is, even the flood benefited life, benefited even the souls whose lives were taken temporarily, so that they could come back in a more orderly and a more structured fashion.